this lecture, we're going to be talking about geologic time. And there are a lot of concepts in this lecture that are really important to some of the overarching themes that we talk about when it comes to physical geology. So some of the learning objectives of this lecture is we're going to cover the meaning of geologic time and the differences between relative and numerical ages. We're going to talk about some geologic principles like uniformitarianism, superposition, fossil succession, and their implications in how we try to understand the deposition and how the Earth has changed over time. We're going to talk about how unconformities form and what they represent and the different types of unconformities, and the basis for correlation or the basis for correlating stratigraphic formations and how they correlation lead to development of a geologic column. We're going to go over some of those concepts using a geologic map to show you how we can create a geologic column, which represents the time of different formations. And we're going to talk about using numerical age of rocks, using isotopic dating, and other techniques that we use to date rocks and date the past, the geologic past, and the basis for determining dates of the geologic timescale and for determining ultimately the age of the Earth. So let's dig in. First, the principle of uniformitarianism. Scientist James Hutton made observations in the mid-1700s that many features like sedimentary structures such as the ripple marks or mud cracks that we talked about in the depositional environment lecture are found in rocks that resemble features that we could see forming in current day. So the whole idea is that the present is the key to the past, and using things that we see in the modern world to help us conceptualize and understand geologic features that are preserved in outcrops and things that have that we can observe based on features that we see today. So we can say that we see mud cracks in a formation right now, and we understand the processes that it takes to create mud cracks based on the present day equivalent. And so we can say, oh, now that we see a rock that has preserved mud cracks, it must resemble similar depositional environments that we see today. Okay, so let's talk about the relative versus numerical age. Relative age is the age of one feature with respect to another in that sequence, as opposed to numerical age, which is the absolute age of a given feature. So if I describe rock formations, sometimes they're in relative age, meaning that the age of the red layer is about 10 million years older than the blue layer, as opposed to saying that in absolute age is that the red layer is 100 million years old and the blue layer is 90 million years old. So there's a difference in description, and geologists can use them interchangeably. We might refer to formations in relative age to other formations. So there's quite a few different geologic principles for defining relative age, and we're going to go over each of these individually. Those are the principles of uniformitarianism, principle of original horizontality, principle of superposition, principle of lateral continuity, principle of cross-cutting relations, principle of baked contacts, and principle of inclusions. Let's take a look. The first is principle of uniformitarianism. This is the physical process we observe operating today and also operated in the past at roughly the same rates. So like I said, if we see sedimentary structures like mud cracks or ripple marks, those tell us about roughly what the depositional environment of the past is based on what we observe today. And that would be the principle of uniformitarianism. Next is the principle of original horizontality. Sediments on Earth settle out of fluids in gravitational field. So surfaces on which the sediments occur, they tend to form in a flat layer. And when we talk about horizontality, we talk about how layers that are deposited first are generally older than the deposits above it, but they're always deposited in a horizontal way, just because we have gravity that causes sediments to fall out and want to deposit in an even layer. So I just alluded to the last one with this one, which is the principle of superposition. In a sequence of sedimentary rock layers, each layer must be younger than the one below it. So for a layer of sediment cannot accumulate unless there's already something below it. The layers at the bottom of the sequence here are older than the layers at the top of the sequence. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule, but in original deposition, and we talk about relative age, these are the principles. Principle of superposition is that sediments first are formed that are older and younger ones are formed on top. Next principle of lateral continuity. Sediments generally accumulate in continuous sheets within a region. And when you see sedimentary layers cut by erosion, by canyon, rivers, things like that, you can assume that the layer once spanned across that entire area and was later on eroded away. So if we have this example here of original deposition, we see that we have lateral continuity of these layers. And what we see today, some time later, is that we see like cutouts here and here. This might form a canyon. We might have a river or something that goes through here and erodes those sediments away. But the principle of lateral continuity says the layer that's developed here was deposited at the same time as the layer that is deposited over here, so that we can assume that over time and over a large region, deposition is continuous. Next, principle of cross-cutting relations. If one geologic feature cuts across another, that feature that has been cut has to be older. So for example, here, if we have a fault, this looks like a chessboard type of feature here. But if we think about how these layers were once continuous, and then we have a fault that lowers one block relative to the other, the fault cuts those layers. So the fault must have occurred after those layers have been formed. I hope that makes sense, because this is a really important piece to the puzzle here. So if we have a stack of layers, and we have one big chunk of layers here, and then they're cut by the fault must occur after all the layers have been deposited. And that's why it looks like this. If we had another, say the blue on top might look like air or water or something, but think about the blue as a different piece of rock. That would have been deposited after the fault occurred. So the fault only cuts these layers of the subsurface. And that's called cross-cutting relations. Next, the principle of baked contacts. We've talked about igneous intrusions in a previous lecture. So when we have an igneous intrusion that bakes or metamorphosizes around a dike or some sort of intrusion, that rock has to be older than the intrusion itself. So think about how we have an igneous intrusion that comes up and we have a lava flow, and right around it is that baked zone. The rock that has been baked must be older than the intrusion itself. Okay, next is principle of inclusion. So a rock containing an inclusion, which is like a fragment of another rock, must be younger than the inclusion. The intrusion must be older than the host rock. In this example here, this is the basalt. The intrusion must be older than the surrounding rock. And this makes sense because if we have this other basalt is an igneous rock, that has to have been formed first in order for it to be embedded into a different rock. So that's the principle of inclusion. Next is the fossil succession. So exposure to sedimentary rocks within fossil assemblages or different groups of species can only be limited to certain strata because fossils don't last forever. And so they're only found in certain geologic time zones and in certain regions and certain periods. So like I had said before in previous lectures, we use different eras, epochs, periods to describe geologic time. So when we look at different periods of the past, geologic periods, certain animals and plants and critters and things like that live only during certain geologic periods. So fossil succession provides us not only the idea of evolution, but also allows us to help date and prove succession. So when we talk about evolution, how some animals have evolved over time, it wouldn't make sense to see certain reptiles that are an evolutionary trait of their predecessors be dated older, if that makes sense. So we use fossil succession to help determine the order in which things are deposited. So let's change gears and talk about unconformities. Unconformities are gaps in the geologic record. This is typically between 2 units and represents a period of non-deposition or erosion. And there's 3 different ways that we see unconformities. We have angular, nonconformity, and disconformity. So let's take a look at each example. First is an angular unconformity. Rocks below the angular unconformity were tilted or rotated, folded, whatever, before the unconformity developed. An angular unconformity cuts across the underlying layers, and the orientation of layers below is different than the layers above. So this one is very visually easy to see. We have deposition of layers, boom, 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 and then say that they get rotated or they get folded. And then those get eroded away through a flooding event or rivers or something. And then we have more deposition on top. And through the principle of lateral continuity, we have horizontal layering on top of this unconformity. Next is a nonconformity. A nonconformity is a type of unconformity at which sedimentary rocks overlie generally much older intrusive igneous rocks or metamorphic rocks. And these igneous or metamorphic rocks underwent cooling, uplift, and erosion prior to becoming the substrate or basement on which new sediments accumulate. So the difference between this last one and this one is that these are the unconformity is on top, generally sedimentary rocks, on top of like igneous or metamorphic rocks here. Okay, next is a disconformity. So imagine that a sequence of sedimentary beds have been deposited beneath a shallow sea. As the sea level drops and erodes down, erodes those beds, there's no new sediment that accumulates. In fact, erosion is just taking place. And then later on, we see a change in depositional environment, like sea level rises and then deposits things on top. So as opposed to an angular unconformity, where this basically just cuts across the deposition, this actually the unconformity is like eroding through those bottom layers, and then deposits are made on top of that. So it's a little bit different in the way that we treat unconformities between a disconformity and an angular unconformity. Typically, when we think angular unconformity, we think about how the beds below are dipping or folded or something like that. So again, unconformities, these are deposition and succession of strata are considered part of the record of the Earth's history. And when we have erosion and unconformities, this is where we have non-record or missing pieces of Earth's history. So now with those 2 things in mind, do you think that there's one place on the Earth where the exposed succession represents all of geologic time? What do you think about that? Well, in short, I think that the Earth is always changing. And so there's no one place that can represent all of these concepts in one location. So in fact, that there's always deposition going on in one place, and then there's erosion going on in another. So there isn't one single place on the Earth's surface where all of this occurs. So let's talk a little bit about stratigraphy. When I say stratigraphy, these are some of the key words that I use. And so here's some of those definitions. I already alluded to a stratigraphic formation. This is an interval of sedimentary strata that's composed over of a specific rock or a group that can be traced over a large region. These are usually extensive type of deposits. A geologic contact is a boundary between two rock bodies, and typically these contacts occur when there's a change in depositional environment. And then we can look at a slice of this or a piece of this in a stratigraphic column. And this is a summary of sequence of strata at a location that depicts certain units, and they're organized from oldest to youngest with relative thicknesses. So let's take a look at that. So here's an example from the Grand Canyon. Here's a little diagram that's not to scale, but if we take a picture of the Grand Canyon and we see what type of geologic formations there are that are present, this is looking at basically what's happened over time. You have some beds that have been rotated here, and of course, there's an unconformity with other layers that have just been tacked on above. And if we look at a stratigraphic column, which is a little snippet of this, or a piece of information that speaks to a relative region as opposed to one specific location, this stratigraphic column shows us a little bit more detail. So we can see here that all of these rocks, they show their relative age respect to each other. This sometimes has a description of what type of rock they are. We can clue into a little bit more detail based on how they're named. So geologists like to put their own name next to it. But like, for example, this is the Coquino sandstone. So we know what a sandstone is, but this is that specific sandstone that is seen here in the Grand Canyon. When we talk about stratigraphic correlation, geologists love to look for patterns, and there's always patterns in everything. And we like to see how they correlate to each other. So with lithologic correlation, these are similarities in successions of rock types. We can also look at fossil correlation, which are similarities over a large area based on that fossil record. So if animals and critters live only during a certain period of time, we can say that the rocks that we see over here are relatively the same. They're correlatable to the rocks way over here because the fossils that exist in that rock are of the same age or are of the same formation. Okay, here's an example. I'm going to move my face. And here's an example of how we might be able to understand what's going on here in this picture. So this might be a little bit complicated, but don't worry, let's step through it. So here is a cartoon diagram of a geologic cross-section. And all of these represent different geologic layers. So each color that you see here could be a different rock or a different formation. So let's try to step through it and see what happens. You have deposition of A, B, C, D, E, F, and then you have this little squiggly line. And the squiggly line represents an unconformity. Okay, so between F and G is an unconformity. So that unconformity occurs, and then we have deposition. We have deposition of layers G, H, I, J, K, and L. Now the other piece in here is trying to decide when this fault occurred. And because we don't have deposition that fills into this area right here that's blank, it can be a little bit difficult to date. What we do know is that the fault does cross formation J, so it's possible that the fault occurs after deposition of J and before K, or we don't have enough information, so it could have occurred after deposition of all of these layers. So sometime between JKL, or perhaps after, is this cross-cutting fault. I hope that makes sense because you're going to have an assignment to try and do this on your own. Let's look at a geologic column. This column represents the entirety of the Earth's history. It's broken up into eons, eras, periods, and epochs. And of course, here on the ages, we have other words to describe this and approximate ages for all of these different ranges here. So basically, this represents all of geologic time. Where we live right here is right at the tippy top here of the Pleistocene. And all of these represent the geologic past, all the way back to the Archean. So when we talk about a geologic column or geologic time, we talk about how many millions of years ago things occurred. And we have different animals that occur we have different plants, and we have all these different depositional areas and plate tectonics and all these things that happen, and we're able to date them, and we use this geologic column to help us describe how old things are. Now, when we look at a geologic map, we can use some of those information that we just talked about to help us understand what's happening in the subsurface. So sometimes all we see is the picture at the surface, and we have to try to use our detective skills to figure out what's going on beneath. So when we're talking about an example of an unconformity here, we look at this in a 3D view. And how do we translate that to a geologic map? Well, if we were to just look at the surface, along this edge right here is an unconformity, and we see all these different layers here along the surface. And based on the dip of these beds, this tells us a little bit about what's happening below the surface. And so these types of indications here, like these little arrows, you might see on a geologic map, and that clues you in to try to understand what's happening below the surface. So on a geologic map, we see all these different layers, and they're labeled here. And we see sometimes a squiggly line that represents unconformities, and this little dashed line, we might see it as a dashed line, or these arrows indicate the axes for subsurface structures like a syncline or like an anticline. So let's look at a geologic map of California. So this is a little bit small here in my PowerPoint presentation, but just looking at it, think about what sort of observations you can make. Where does your eye get drawn to? Can you see some of these larger features? Are there large features? Do you see faults? What sort of things do you see right off the bat? Well, one of the things that my eye is drawn to is this big elongated shape right here in the center that is a little bit grayish in color or brownish in color relative to everything around it. And these represent quaternary sediments. These are very young relative to everything around it. And when we look at a geologic map, these are the sediments that are at the surface. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that there aren't older rocks present or that they don't exist anymore. These are just the things that have been uplifted or that are present at the surface. So the oldest sediment here, the oldest rocks, I should say, are Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic. These are in the bluish color. And here around the coastal region, we see things that are mostly tertiary sedimentary rocks. We see a few Mesozoic sedimentary rocks. And in orange are volcanic rocks. So this tells us a little bit about the different deposition that has occurred during those times in different parts of the state of California. There's a huge variety of, of geologic activity that goes around here. And you can see these little black lines. These represent some of the faults. So here, if you see my mouse, this is the San Andreas that cuts through most of the state of California. And even through here, even through Ventura County area, we have a lot of other more west-eastward type of faults. So there's a lot of faults that are active and that are cross-cutting a lot of these features. Let's talk a little bit more about geologic time. How old is old, and how do we determine what old means? How do we determine what age a rock is or a fossil is? And we use a few different things, tools. We use radioactive decay, isotopic dating, and tree growth and ice cores. So radioactive decay, this is really important to the concepts of how old the Earth actually is. Radioactive elements have a natural tendency to decay, and this is called the half-life. Radioactive dating was discovered in the 1950s to measure the presence of radioactive elements in a rock and how far along they are in their half-life. So when things are formed, when we have certain elements, they have an associated half-life. So when we look at these radioactive elements, we can roughly determine when they've been deposited and where they originated. And this is a key into understanding how old really is. So I have an example to try to illustrate what radioactive decay is. We're going to use a bunch of coins to demonstrate the decay. And I'm going to walk you through it and show you the video, and then we're going to look at the data. In this lecture, I'm going to use a bunch of coins to help illustrate what radioactive decay is. So the first thing to do is I have about 60 coins in here. You can do this exercise yourself at home. I'm going to shake this bag up, and then I'm going to pour it out and separate the coins that have naturally flipped over to heads and versus tails. So I'm going to pause this and show you the result.
75 years later.
I've separated out the heads and tails, and I have 33 heads coins here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down 33. I'm going to show you how I use that later. And now I'm going to put those coins that were flipped heads back into the bag. And I'm going to shake them up again. I'm going to move my tails coins over to the corner here. And now I'm going to shake the bag again, pour them out. And of these, I'm going to also count out the number of heads and tails.
6 months later!
Once again, I've counted out the number of heads and tails. I have 17 coins here that are heads. Again, I'm going to put them back in this bag, and we're going to do the same thing here and reshuffle up these coins. And I'm going to move my tails over into this corner with the rest of the other coins that are still tails. I'm going to shake it up, and we're going to keep doing this. It's going to take a few more iterations to get to the final, so I'm going to spare you the details and show you the results.
A little later.
Okay, so I just shook out the last two coins here. They both ended up being tails. So now if we look at my data that I wrote down here of the distribution of heads and tails, we're going to put this into Excel and show you the decay curve. All right, so let's look at the data that we just created using that demo here. So hopefully the demo showed you what I tried to do with the different coins and flipping from head to tail. So let's look at the data. Okay, so here we go. It took me 8 coin tosses in order to demonstrate the entire half-life of the number of coins. So the number of coins that I had in my bag, I started with 60. When we talk about half-life, we usually use a nice number like 100, but in this case, we just use 60, which is fine. And on my first coin toss, I had 33 heads and 27 tails. Now, if you remember, I separated those coins that were tails. I moved them aside. And then my second toss was 17 heads and 16 tails. So I added 16 to the other tails that accumulated on the corner of my table there, and so on and so forth. So it took me 8 coin tosses, which means that's the number of half-lives it took for me to reach basically the end of the isotope life here. And we can see how this crossed. The blue represents the number of heads, and the orange represents the number of tails. So even with this really simple example, we're able to simulate what half-life is. And we see the half-life again of radioactive elements, these isotopes, as they decay over time. So let's go back to lecture. And so when we talk about isotopic dating techniques, this is where we use it for most common radioactive elements. So this chart shows the parent and daughter. So I guess I didn't explain this very well. When we have say the heads curve versus the tail curve, the heads would be the parent and the tails would be the daughter. So when we talk about it in the context of certain elements, the one that is used most often is uranium. That's the parent, and the daughter to that is lead. So we usually see this in uranium-bearing minerals like zircon, or another common one that is used frequently is potassium to argon, and we see these in things like mica and feldspar and hornblende. Maybe some of those words are things you remember when we talked about them in the mineral section. So we go from parent to daughter, and that time it takes, the number of half-lives it takes for that decay to occur, helps us understand in a lab setting how old those rocks are. So for uranium 238 to decay to lead 206 takes 4.5 billion years. So it took me 8 coin tosses. So if you think about how long, in terms of not just number of tosses, but how many number of years it takes for that decay to occur, this is how we're able to date them. So rock samples are acquired, they're crushed and analyzed in a lab setting to determine that parent to daughter ratio of isotopes in a half-life decay. And I just want to reiterate to you that the Earth is indeed very old. We have scientific techniques, we have scientific proof that shows that the Earth is very old. It is not 4,000 years old, it is 4.6 billion years old, and they're getting better at dating it. So when we talk about different dating techniques, science is only getting better, but we have proof that the Earth is very old. And we have a few other things that we use to try to date things. We use things like tree growth and ice cores. So how do we do that using trees? Well, tree growth is dependent on the season. And when we look at a slice of a tree, we might be able to correlate things associated with how thick that tree ring is with things that have been happening in the earth. So if it's a really wet year, or if it's you might have a larger tree ring than if there's a lot of drought going on. And we can use relative tree growth. So say a tree exists now, we might be able to correlate these really distinctive rings to a tree that's a bit older and a bit older from that, and so on and so forth. So tree rings can help date events and can help date rocks and fossils and things like that based on relative cores and sometimes even buried trees and roots to help us get to those dating. And the record can be up to a few thousands of years. So again, we use this for a shorter time than what we use for radioactive decay dating, but at least it's another source to help us understand how old things are. Next is ice cores or glaciers. And we have seasonal changes that affect snow accumulation and therefore ice accumulation. And we have hydrogen and oxygen that is trapped inside these ice cores. And so over time, we can use different techniques to make correlations with how much CO2 has been in the atmosphere, to regional temperatures, to other types of gases that may have been trapped inside those cores. And so we're able to use ice core data for dating, but also for regional temperatures and regional effects that have been fluctuating around the Earth. Okay, so in this lecture, we talked about geologic time and the differences between relative and numerical ages. We talked about geologic principles of uniformitarianism, superposition, and fossil succession and their implications. We gave 3 examples of unconformities. We talked about correlating stratigraphic formations and ultimately how to use a geologic column in the stratigraphic column. We talked about how we use numerical age of rocks or how we date them using isotopic dating and tree rings and also ice cores. And this is the basis of determining geologic timescale and for ultimately determining how old the Earth is. So that's it for this lecture. See you next time.